The door to Dalton's general store swung open so hard it cracked against the wall, and every person in Redemption Creek, Texas, turned to look at the man who filled the frame like a storm had taken human shape. Cyrus Wells stood 6 feet and 2 inches of lean, sun-weathered muscle, his black duster coat trailing dust from 100 miles of hard riding. The twin Colt revolvers at his hips were not decoration. The scar that ran from his left jawline to his collarbone was not a story he told at dinner tables. His gray eyes swept the crowded store misses. Hartley clutching her flour sack, old Reverend Potts with his mouth hanging open, Sheriff Dale Granger frozen near the pickle barrel, 3 ranchers from the Whitmore outfit standing in a guilty knot near the back wall, and those eyes settled, heavy as iron on each face in turn. Then Cyrus Wells walked to the center of that store, his boots striking the floorboards like a judge's gavel, and he said in a voice that was low and even and absolute, "Every person in this town owes you an apology." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it, the kind that presses down on chests and makes honest people look at their shoes. Gertrude Dalton stood behind her counter, a tin of coffee beans in one hand and a cloth in the other, and she stared at this man she had never seen before in her life. She was 31 years old, with dark auburn hair pinned severely at the nape of her neck, a jaw set with the particular hardness of someone who had survived things that should have broken her, and eyes the color of strong tea that had seen far too much disappointment to be surprised by very much any more. But she was surprised now. Her lips parted, her fingers tightened around the coffee tin. And something in her chest, something she had bolted shut and buried under 2 years of silent endurance and solitary labor, and the daily small humiliations of being a woman running a business alone in a town that did not want her to succeed, that something cracked open like old timber under heat. "Who are you?" she said, and her voice did not waver, because Gertrude Dalton had not let her voice waver in front of this town since the day she buried her brother and inherited a store full of debt and enemies. "Cyrus Wells," he said, "and you are Gertrude Dalton. Your brother wrote me a letter before he died." The tin of coffee beans hit the counter with a sound like a gunshot. The town had never stopped its small, secret war against Gertrude Dalton, and it had begun the way most betrayals begin, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet choice made by people who should have known better. It was the summer of 1879 when Gertrude had arrived in Redemption Creek, Texas, riding the stage from San Antonio with 2 trunks, a ledger book, and a document that said she owned half of Dalton's general store, the other half belonging to her younger brother, Edmund Dalton, who had been building the place for 3 years with his own hands and his own sweat and more hope than a man of 28 had any right to carry. Edmund had written her letters. Wonderful letters, full of detail and humor, and the particular joy of a man who had found his purpose. He described the store in such loving terms that Gertrude had been able to picture every shelf and every beam before she ever set foot inside it. He described the town with the generous eyes of someone who believed in people. He described his plans, his dreams, his conviction that Redemption Creek was going to grow into something magnificent, and that Dalton's general store would grow with it. What Edmund had not described, or perhaps what he had not fully understood until it was too late, was that there was a man in Redemption Creek named Harlan Whitmore who had decided that the building Edmund Dalton had constructed on the eastern corner of Main Street ought to belong to him. Harlan Whitmore owned the largest cattle operation in 3 counties. He owned the bank. He owned the opinion of the sheriff, who was a man named Dale Granger with expensive tastes and a convenient memory. He owned the loyalty of the town council through a combination of favors given and debts created, and he had spent 20 years making himself the kind of man that Redemption Creek could not imagine functioning without. He wanted the Dalton store because it sat at the intersection of 2 roads, and he had grand plans for a freight depot that would require that precise location. He had offered Edmund Dalton a price that was insultingly low, and Edmund had declined. He had offered a second time, and Edmund had declined again. He had then begun a campaign of quiet, grinding pressure that included denying Edmund credit at the bank, spreading rumors about the quality of the store's goods, and having Sheriff Granger cite Edmund for meaningless violations that required fines Edmund could not afford. Edmund had not bent. And then one night in March of 1879, Edmund Dalton had ridden his horse out to check on a supply delivery and had been found dead the next morning at the bottom of the ravine south of town. The official ruling was an accident. His horse had spooked. He had fallen. Gertrude had read that letter sitting in a boarding house in San Antonio, and something cold and permanent had moved into her heart. She had come to Redemption Creek anyway. She had come because the store was hers now, entirely, with Edmund gone, and because she was not a woman who surrendered to pressure, and because somewhere in the territory between grief and rage, there was a place where a person could plant their feet and refuse to move, and Gertrude Dalton had always been very good at finding that place. She had also come because she suspected, with a certainty she could not yet prove, that her brother had not fallen from his horse by accident. Redemption Creek had not welcomed her. The welcome had been so precisely the opposite of warm that it almost had a design to it. Harlan Whitmore had come to call on her within 3 days of her arrival, bringing his hat and his wide, flat smile, and an offer for the store that was only slightly less insulting than the one he had made to Edmund. Gertrude had offered him coffee and declined. He had left without the smile. After that, things became difficult in small, deniable ways. The freight company that delivered supplies began having persistent delays with her orders. Certain residents who had been loyal customers of Edmund's began finding reasons to shop elsewhere. The women of the town treated her with a particular species of cold politeness that communicated very clearly that a single woman running a business without male supervision was an uncomfortable fact they preferred not to engage with. The men were worse, because most of them avoided looking at her directly, which meant most of them felt guilty about something, and guilt in a man who lacks the courage to act on it almost always curdles into hostility. Through all of it, Gertrude had kept the store open. She had kept her accounts in careful order. She had learned which suppliers would deal with her honestly and which would not, and she had found alternatives. She had worked from before dawn to after dark, and she had made the store profitable through sheer force of will and an intimate knowledge of what the people around her actually needed, regardless of whether they admitted needing it from her. She had also kept asking questions about the night Edmund died, quietly and persistently, in the way that a woman asking questions can when people underestimate her capacity to listen. She had written a letter herself to a man whose name she had found in Edmund's private correspondence, a letter Edmund had drafted but apparently never sent, addressed to a former Army scout and bounty hunter named Cyrus Wells, asking for help. She had rewritten it in her own words, added everything she knew, and sent it 4 months ago without certainty that it would find him or that he would come. And now he was standing in her store, with the entire town of Redemption Creek frozen around him like a painting of guilt, and he had said the words that 2 years of loneliness and injustice had made her half despair of ever hearing. After the crowd had cleared, and they cleared quickly, because Cyrus Wells's presence in the room made people feel the urgent need to be elsewhere, Gertrude locked the front door, turned the sign, and looked at this man who had ridden in from nowhere with her brother's letter and her own desperate hope, and she said, "Sit down, Mr. Wells, and tell me everything." He sat across from her at the small table she kept near the cold stove, and he placed Edmund's letter on the table between them, and he told her. He and Edmund had served together in the Army briefly, years before, and had kept an intermittent correspondence afterward. Edmund's letters had grown increasingly concerned over the 18 months before his death. He had been documenting what Whitmore was doing to him. He had been collecting evidence. And in the last letter before his death, he had told Cyrus that if anything happened to him, there was a woman who would need someone in her corner. He had described his sister in 4 words: stubborn, brilliant, brave, and entirely too alone. Gertrude listened to all of this with her hands flat on the table and her expression very still. "Did he say anything about evidence?" she asked. "Specific evidence of what Whitmore was doing?" Cyrus looked at her steadily. "He said he had documents. He said they were hidden somewhere safe. He said you would know where." Gertrude was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He always hid things in the inventory ledger. He had a system. Numbers that looked like stock counts but were dates and amounts." She went to the shelf behind the counter, lifted a loose floorboard that she had found by accident 3 months after her arrival when a supply crate had knocked it loose, and produced a leather-bound ledger that was thicker and more worn than a simple inventory book had any right to be. She brought it back to the table and opened it, and the two of them bent over it together. And in the small circle of lamplight in the locked store, with the sounds of Redemption Creek moving outside the windows, Gertrude Dalton began to translate her dead brother's hidden language. It was meticulous and damning. Edmund had recorded every instance of interference, every bribe he had witnessed, every conversation he had overheard. He had names, dates, amounts. He had documented 3 separate incidents of Harlan Whitmore, directing Sheriff Granger to levy false fines against businesses that resisted his influence. He had documented the systematic exclusion of a Mexican family named Espinoza from the bank's lending practices on no legitimate grounds. He had documented a fraudulent land deed transfer that had dispossessed an elderly widow named Clara Purdy of 40 acres that legally belonged to her. And near the back of the book, in Edmund's tightest and most careful handwriting, was an account of a conversation he had overheard between Harlan Whitmore and a man named Brock Kane, who was Whitmore's foreman, in which Whitmore had said, with explicit and terrible clarity, that if Edmund Dalton could not be bought then, Edmund Dalton needed to be removed from the equation, and that the ravine south of town was a dangerous road to ride at night. Gertrude read this passage twice. Her hands did not tremble, but her jaw was so tight that a small muscle jumped at the hinge of it, and Cyrus, watching her, felt something move through him that was not merely professional concern. "He was murdered," Gertrude said. "It was not a question." "Yes," Cyrus said, "and this is enough to prove it if we can get it in front of the right judge." "The right judge," Gertrude said, "not the judge in this county who eats Sunday dinner at Harlan Whitmore's table." "No," Cyrus agreed, "not him." They looked at each other across the ledger, and there was something in that exchange that was entirely practical and entirely honest, and for Gertrude Dalton, absolutely unprecedented in her 2 years in Redemption Creek. Someone was looking at her as an equal. Someone was taking her seriously. Someone was sitting across from her and treating the danger she was in as a real thing that required a real response rather than a hysterical overcorrection from an over-emotional woman. She found this so disarming that she had to look away. "You should know," she said, studying the ledger, "that Whitmore will have heard you were in here within the hour. He has eyes everywhere in this town." "I'm counting on it," Cyrus said. She looked up. "You want him to know you're here." "I want him scared," Cyrus said. "Scared men make mistakes." Gertrude considered this. "And what is your role in this exactly, Mr. Wells? What is it you intend to do?" "Get justice for your brother," he said simply. "And make sure you don't end up at the bottom of that ravine too." The words landed quietly and sat there, and Gertrude found she had nothing to say to them that did not reveal more than she currently wished to reveal. "I have a spare room above the store," she said at last. "It is not comfortable." "I've slept in considerably less comfort than a room," Cyrus said. "I will not have anyone in this town saying things about my reputation," Gertrude said, and her voice was flat and matter-of-fact. "Not because I particularly care what they think, but because I cannot afford the distraction right now." A very faint expression crossed Cyrus Wells's face. It might have been amusement. It was difficult to tell because his face was not a face that had been much practiced in the display of easy emotion. "I'll be circumspect," he said. "Good," said Gertrude. and you can start earning your keep in the morning by carrying the supply crates from the loading dock. I have a delivery arriving at sunrise that I've been handling alone for 6 months." He looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes that held the particular quality of someone who was always watching for danger, and he said, "Yes, ma'am." She showed him the room upstairs, which was spare and clean because Gertrude kept everything spare and clean, handed him a lantern and a blanket, and went back downstairs to finish closing the store. She stood alone in the dark for a long time after, her hand on the ledger, and she let herself feel for exactly 30 seconds the full weight of the secret hope that had just walked through her door. Then she put it away and went to bed and slept better than she had in 2 years. In the morning she woke before the sun and had coffee on the stove and biscuits in the pan by the time Cyrus came downstairs, and he stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked at the scene with an expression that was brief and involuntary and almost painfully soft before he shuttered it behind the professional exterior he habitually wore. She handed him a cup and said, "The delivery wagon comes from the South Road. The crates of dry goods are heaviest." He said, "Tell me about the town. Who matters, who can be moved, and who is Whitmore's entirely?" They talked over breakfast in the early gray light, and Gertrude found herself speaking with a fluency and a specificity that surprised even her. She had spent 2 years observing Redemption Creek with the frustrated attention of someone who knows something is wrong and cannot yet find the lever that will fix it. She had cataloged people and their weaknesses and their decencies with the precision of a general mapping contested terrain. Sheriff Granger was owned. The bank clerk, a thin man named Percy Doyle, was frightened rather than corrupt, a meaningful distinction. The minister, Reverend Potts, had moral convictions that were genuine but easily suppressed by social pressure. The owner of the saloon, a woman named Vera Lund, had no love for Whitmore and considerable information about the private behaviors of the powerful, if she could be persuaded to share it. The Mexican family Espinoza Rodrigo, his wife Alina, and their 2 adult sons were industrious and skilled, and had been systematically excluded from economic participation by Whitmore's influence. They had grievances that were documented in Edmund's ledger, and a resentment that was entirely justified. Cyrus listened to all of this with focused attention, asking sharp, clarifying questions, and when the delivery wagon arrived, he went out and handled the crates with an efficiency that made Gertrude privately note that he was considerably more useful than she had allowed herself to hope. By mid-morning, word had definitely spread that a stranger with guns was staying above Dalton's store. Gertrude could read it in the way people moved past her windows, in the brief glances, in the conspicuous absence of anyone from the Whitmore operation on Main Street. The first person to come through the door was Percy Doyle, the bank clerk, who arrived with an expression of a man walking towards something he was fairly sure was going to hurt him, but who had decided to do it anyway. He asked for a small order of tobacco, and then stood at the counter turning his hat in his hands and said, in a very low voice, "Miss Dalton, I want you to know that I have never been comfortable with the way things are conducted at the bank in regard to your accounts." Gertrude looked at him carefully. "Is that so, Mr. Doyle?" "I have certain records," Percy said, "that document lending decisions that were not made on legitimate financial grounds. With regard to you and to others, I have kept them because I thought someday they might be important." He paused. "I heard there's someone in town who might know what to do with that kind of information." Gertrude kept her expression neutral with considerable effort. "You should speak to Mr. Wells," she said. "He'll be back by 2 o'clock." Percy Doyle nodded, put his hat on and left, and Gertrude exhaled slowly. By the time Cyrus returned that afternoon, Percy was waiting on the bench outside and handed over a carefully folded set of documents with the air of a man setting down a burden he had carried too long. That evening, Rodrigo Espinoza came to the back door of the store, which was the door that did not face the main street, and asked to speak to the man people were saying had come to look into Edmund Dalton's death. His English was careful and formal, and his dignity was complete, and he brought with him his own documentation of what had been done to his family, and his own quiet anger that had nowhere to go in a town where the law was owned. Cyrus sat with him for an hour and treated him with a respect that was absolute and uncomplicated, and Gertrude, moving quietly between the back storeroom and the main floor, observed this and felt something warm and inconvenient settle in her chest. On the third day, Vera Lund came in for canning supplies and stayed for 2 hours, and told Cyrus and Gertrude, in detailed and highly specific terms, about the conversations she had overheard between Harlan Whitmore and various members of the town council in the private room at the back of the saloon, and about a particular conversation between Whitmore and Brock Kane that had taken place 2 days before Edmund Dalton's body was found at the bottom of the ravine. Gertrude wrote everything down in a new ledger, cross-referenced with Edmund's existing documentation, building the case with the systematic care of someone who has waited 2 years for this moment and intends to do it correctly. On the 4th day, Harlan Whitmore came to the store himself. He was a large man in his 50s, with the kind of face that had been handsome in youth, and had settled into an authority that people sometimes confused with trustworthiness. He wore an expensive suit, and carried himself with the absolute confidence of a man who has not been genuinely challenged in a long time. He came in at mid-morning with 2 of his men flanking him at a polite but unmistakable distance, and he looked at Gertrude with a smile that she had always found particularly nauseating because it was so precisely calibrated. "Miss Dalton," he said, "I understand you have a guest." "I have a number of customers," Gertrude said pleasantly. "It is a store." Whitmore's smile did not move. "I'm referring to the man who's been asking questions around town. A former Army scout, I'm told. I'd recommend against hosting certain kinds of trouble, Miss Dalton. Redemption Creek is a peaceful town, and we like to keep it that way." "I appreciate your concern for the peace," Gertrude said, and her voice was so level and warm that it took a moment to notice the absolute absence of any deference in it. Whitmore looked at her for a moment with his smile in place, and something considerably less pleasant moving behind his eyes. Then Cyrus Wells came through the door from the back storeroom with a crate of molasses, set it on the counter without apparent hurry, and looked at Whitmore with the particular quality of attention that a man gives when he is completely prepared for something to happen, and is entirely comfortable with that preparedness. The 2 men looked at each other, and the air in the store changed in the way that air changes when 2 forces of equal determination occupy the same space. "Mr. Whitmore," Cyrus said, flat. "Informational, nothing more." "Mr. Wells," Whitmore said, "I've heard of you." "Most people in the territory have," Cyrus said. "It's rarely been a comfort to them." Whitmore held the look for another moment, then turned back to Gertrude with a smile that had grown a visible edge. "Think carefully about the path you're choosing, Miss Dalton. I would hate to see anything unfortunate happen to this establishment." He paused to let that settle. "It would be such a shame to see all your hard work come to nothing." He left, and his men left behind him, and the door swung closed, and Gertrude stood very still for a moment with her hands flat on the counter. "That was a threat," she said. "That was a man who's frightened," Cyrus said. "Those are not mutually exclusive," Gertrude said. "No," he agreed. "They are not." She looked at him then, and something in the directness of that look felt different than the looks that had come before. She was aware, and had been aware for 4 days in a way she was finding increasingly difficult to manage, that Cyrus Wells was one of the most compelling human beings she had ever encountered. Not in the slick or obvious way of men who knew they were attractive. In a deeper and more unsettling way, the way of someone whose character was so present in everything they did that it created a kind of gravity. He watched her with those gray eyes that missed nothing, and she thought he was probably aware of more than she was comfortable with. "I'm going to ride out to the ravine today," he said. "I want to look at the site." "I've been there," she said, "several times." "I know. I'd like you to come. You'll see things I won't." She closed the store for the afternoon and saddled her mare, a solid bay named Anna after an aunt who had shared the horse's combination of reliability and temper, and they rode south together through the spring heat. The ravine was a steep cut in the earth about 3 miles from town, where the road curved close to a limestone edge. She had stood here and looked down at the pale rocks below more times than she wanted to count, trying to understand what had happened, trying to make the geography of the place say something it was keeping from her. Cyrus dismounted and walked the edge carefully, crouching here and there, touching the ground, looking at the angles. He was methodical in a way that was not dramatic but was deeply serious, and Gertrude found herself watching his hands as much as his face, watching the way he moved with a body that had been taught through hard experience exactly how much force various things required. "Here," he said finally, crouching near a section of the cliff edge. "Come look." She crouched beside him. He was pointing at the rock where there were marks that she had looked at before but had not known how to read. "Horses' hooves don't make these marks when an animal panics and stumbles," he said. "These are consistent with a horse that was being held and then driven. Someone was here, someone pushed him." Gertrude looked at the marks for a long time, then she stood up. "Brock Kane," she said. "He's the one Vera heard talking to Whitmore." "Kane," Cyrus confirmed. "And Kane reports to Whitmore. Can this be used as evidence? With a good tracker's testimony and the documented conversation Vera overheard and Edmund's own notes, yes." He paused. "We need to get these materials to the Federal Circuit Court in Austin. Judge Harrington sits there. He's not Whitmore's. He's been investigating land fraud across the territory for 2 years, and this case fits into a broader pattern he's already examining." "How do you know that?" Gertrude asked. There was a brief pause. "Because I've been working with him," Cyrus said. "Not officially, but Edmund's letter came to me at a time when I was already looking into Whitmore's operation from a different angle. Harrington asked me to look into certain land transactions. Edmund's case connects." Gertrude was very still for a moment. "You have been investigating Whitmore before you got my letter." "Yes, Edmund was part of that investigation. He became part of it when he started keeping records." Cyrus looked at her steadily. He didn't know the full scope of what he'd stumbled into. He was just trying to protect his store. But the pattern he documented was part of something larger. "And you came here to finish what Edmund started," Gertrude said slowly, and her voice had a quality to it that was neither accusation nor absolution, but something more complicated. "I came here because your brother trusted me enough to write my name in a letter he never sent," Cyrus said. "And because you trusted me enough to send it. And because what was done to Edmund and what is being done to you is a genuine injustice that I am in a position to address. All of those things are true at the same time." She looked at him for a long moment with her strong T eyes. "Are you an honest man, Mr. Wells?" "I am a man who has done things that required confession," he said, "but I have never been dishonest in anything I told you." She nodded once. "Good," she said. "That's all I needed to know." They rode back in a silence that had a different quality to it than the silences that had come before. Something had shifted in the accounting between them. The professional distance that Gertrude had maintained was still present, but it had developed a permeability that she was aware of without being ready to address. That night after supper, she had begun cooking enough for 2 without discussing it, and he had begun helping without being asked. They sat at the table with Edmund's ledger and the documents from Percy Doyle and the testimony notes from Vera Lund and Rodrigo Espinosa, and they built the case together like 2 people constructing something that needed to be strong enough to bear real weight. She was aware of his hands near hers on the table. She was aware of the particular quality of focused intelligence he brought to the work, the way he would read something and then be still for a moment before asking exactly the right question. She was aware of the way he sometimes looked at her when he thought she was absorbed in the ledger, with an expression that he clearly had no idea she could see. She was not good at this. She knew that about herself with clear-eyed honesty. She was good at work and at endurance and at keeping her own counsel, but the territory of personal feeling was one she had not inhabited comfortably since she was very young and life had not yet taught her how much feeling could cost. She had been engaged once briefly to a man in San Antonio who had turned out to want the idea of her intelligence more than the reality of it, and the ending of that had been cold and instructive. Cyrus Wells was nothing like that man. Cyrus Wells appeared to want her to be exactly as intelligent and capable and uncompromising as she was, and seemed to find this not threatening but clarifying, the way a compass is clarifying, and this was more disarming than any compliment could have been. She told herself firmly that she did not have time for this. On the fifth day, Whitmore made his move. It came in the form of a fire, not the store that would have been too obvious and too final. Instead, it was the storage shed behind the store, where Gertrude kept 3 months' worth of dry goods. At 3 in the morning she smelled smoke and came downstairs to find the shed fully involved, and she and Cyrus and 2 neighboring businesses spent an hour forming a bucket chain from the well before it was contained, and the shed was gone, and most of what was in it. She stood in the ash and looked at what had been $600 worth of inventory, and she felt the full weight of the betrayal, because that was what it was, the betrayal of a community that had watched this woman struggle for 2 years and done nothing, the betrayal of justice by a system that was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of naked power abuse, and she felt it without expression, standing in the gray pre-dawn with ash on her face. Cyrus stood beside her and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "How much?" "Enough to ruin this month's accounts," she said. "Not enough to close the store." "Whitmore needs to know it's not enough," he said. "He'll know in the morning when the store opens," she said. She opened the store at sunrise on 4 hours of sleep with ash still probably in her hair, and she did not close early, and she did not falter, and she heard the whispers from people who came in, and she met them with the same flat-eyed courteous service she always provided, and Cyrus was at the counter beside her for all of it, and his presence was not protective in the way that was condescending but protective in the way that was a declaration of alignment. By midday something was shifting. She could feel it. The fire had crossed a line for people who had been standing carefully on the other side of that line. Mrs. Hartley, who had been coldly polite to Gertrude for 2 years, came in with a jar of preserves and put them on the counter without saying anything, and her eyes were red. Reverend Potts came in and bought nothing but stood for a while, and then said, with the awkward delivery of a man giving a speech he had practiced and still found insufficient, that he was deeply sorry for not speaking up sooner about the treatment Miss Dalton had received in this community. Old Tom Figgins, who ran the livery stable and had refused her credit for a horse last year, sent his boy over with a $50 bill and a note that said he was contributing to replacing the shed. Gertrude received all of this with grace and without theatrics, and each instance felt like the slow extraction of a small, poisonous splinter that had been embedded for so long she had almost stopped feeling it. That evening, Cyrus found her sitting on the back steps of the store in the hour before dark, looking at the burned patch of ground where the shed had been. He sat down beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cooling air, and for a while neither of them spoke. "This needs to end soon," he said. "For your sake he'll escalate." "I know," she said. "How long to get a message to Austin? 3 days riding hard. I have a man in San Marcos who rides for Harrington. If I can get the documents to him, he can have them in Austin within the week. Then we need to move quickly." She paused. "I should go with you to San Marcos. The store can be managed for 2 days by the Espinosa brothers if they're willing," she said. "I've spoken to Louis already. He's honest and capable." She looked at Cyrus directly. "I'm not sitting here waiting for something else to burn, Mr. Wells. I have been reactive for 2 years. I will not be reactive anymore." He held her gaze for a moment with an expression that she was learning to read the momentary struggle between the professional assessment and something more personal that he was careful about, and then the professional assessment won, as it generally did, but the something more personal left a trace in the air. "All right," he said. "We ride at dawn." But before dawn came, there was Brock Kane. Gertrude was awake before the first light, packing the documents into a leather satchel with the careful precision of someone handling explosive materials, when she heard the sound on the stairs. Not Cyrus's step, which she had learned precisely in 5 days measured, even the step of someone who moved deliberately through the world. This was lighter and more careful and wrong. She blew out the lamp and stood very still in the dark store, and the door at the top of the stairs opened, and a man came down with a knife in his hand. She was behind the counter. She reached under it for the shotgun she had kept there since her 2nd month in Redemption Creek, loaded and waiting with the absolute practicality of a woman who lives alone, and she said, in a voice that was steady and clear in the darkness, "I have a shotgun pointed at your chest." The man on the stairs stopped. Then Cyrus's voice came from above, sharp and close. "Kane." A moment of absolute stillness, and then Brock Kane, who was a large and not particularly clever man whose loyalty to Whitmore was a function of salary rather than conviction, made the decision that preserved his life, which was to put the knife down on the step and put his hands up. The lamp came back on, and Gertrude kept the shotgun leveled while Cyrus came down behind Kane with a Colt in hand. And between the two of them they secured Brock Kane to the chair by the stove with a length of rope from the supply shelf. And then Gertrude made coffee because her hands needed something to do, and because she would later reflect, an intensely practical person, even under considerable stress. Cyrus sat across from Kane in the lamplight and asked questions in a tone that was quiet and without inflection, and therefore considerably more frightening than shouting would have been. And Brock Kane, who had not signed up for this level of consequence when he had agreed to keep Whitmore's various secrets, told them everything. He confirmed what Edmund's ledger said about the night at the ravine. He confirmed that Whitmore had ordered it. He confirmed the false fines, the fraudulent land deal, the bank discrimination. He listed names and dates with the desperate helpfulness of a man who has decided that self-preservation outweighs loyalty. Gertrude wrote it all down. Her handwriting was very small and very regular, and she did not let her feelings into it. When Kane was finished, Cyrus said, "You'll testify to this before a federal judge." "Whitmore will kill me," Kane said. "Whitmore is going to be in no position to kill anyone," Cyrus said. "And if you refuse to testify, I'll see to it personally that your involvement in Edmund Dalton's death is the headline of your future." Kane looked at Gertrude, who was looking at him with an expression that was not vindictive but was entirely unyielding. "All right," he said. They rode to San Marcos that morning with Brock Kane bound and riding between them, and the leather satchel of documents strapped securely to Cyrus's saddle. It was a long ride through the hot Texas spring, through mesquite and cedar, and the smell of the land doing its ancient business around them, and they rode mostly in silence with Kane between them as an obstacle to easy conversation. But in the late afternoon, when they had stopped at a creek to water the horses and Kane was tied to a tree at a respectful distance, Cyrus said, without preamble, "When this is over, what do you intend to do?" Gertrude looked up from the water. "Keep the store," she said immediately. He nodded. "You've built something good there." "Edmund built it," she said. "I kept it. There's a difference." "There isn't," Cyrus said, and the simplicity of it stopped her. "Building a thing is easy compared to keeping it when everything is arranged against you." She looked at him for a moment, and the afternoon sun was in his face, and he looked like what he was, a man who had spent his life in hard country doing necessary things, with the lines of that life clear on him, and a fundamental goodness that was not soft but was genuine. "What do you intend to do?" she asked. "When it's over." He was quiet for a moment. "I have been moving for a long time," he said. "I'm not certain I know how to stop." "You could learn," she said, and immediately felt the ground shift under the word as she heard how much was in it. He looked at her steadily. "Are you inviting me to learn, Miss Dalton?" She held his gaze and said nothing for a moment that stretched out with the quality of something important happening, and then she said, "I am suggesting the theoretical possibility is not as remote as you might think." And something in his expression moved, slowly, like light moving on water, and it was the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him, and it was more powerful for its rarity. They delivered the documents and brought Kane to Cyrus's contact in San Marcos, a quiet, capable man named Amos Whitfield who took everything with the efficiency of long practice and promised to have it all before Judge Harrington within 4 days. They rode back to Redemption Creek the next morning, and the dynamic between them was the same and entirely different, like a chord that has gained a new note. She told him, on the ride back, about San Antonio, about the man who had not wanted her to actually be herself. She told it briefly and without drama, but she told it, and that was a thing she had not told anyone in Redemption Creek. He listened without interruption, and then he said, "A man who is frightened of a woman's intelligence is a man who has misunderstood what intelligence is for." "And what is it for?" she asked. "Partnership," he said. "Understanding things together that you can't understand alone." She looked at the road ahead and thought about that for a long time. When they arrived back in Redemption Creek, the town had clearly spent 2 days fermenting. There were conversations happening on Main Street that stopped when they rode through, and the nature of the stopping was different from before. Not the guilty avoidance she had experienced for 2 years, but something closer to shame searching for a form. Harlan Whitmore's response, when the word reached him that Kane had talked and that documents were on their way to Austin, was immediate and badly calculated. He went to Sheriff Granger and demanded that Cyrus Wells be arrested on fabricated charges, and Granger, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with the direction things were heading, made the decision that finally tipped the balance of his life. He refused. It was not a heroic refusal. It was the refusal of a frightened man who had looked at the situation and decided that Harlan Whitmore's protection was a less reliable guarantee of his future than he had previously believed. But it was a refusal, and in the moral economy of Redemption Creek it had significance. Whitmore, without Granger's cooperation and without Kane, and with his documented crimes on their way to a federal judge, made the last mistake of his empire. He rode to Dalton's general store himself, alone, with a revolver on his hip and the particular desperation of a powerful man watching his power end. He came through the door at noon with the revolver already in his hand, and he looked at Gertrude behind the counter and said, "Give me those documents." Gertrude looked at him very calmly and said, "They are in Austin, Mr. Whitmore. It's too late." The moment that followed was the kind of moment that can go in any of several directions, and Gertrude had spent enough time in difficult circumstances to understand that the most important thing she could do was remain absolutely still and absolutely calm, because panic and stillness look nothing alike to a desperate man with a gun. Cyrus came from the back of the store. He did not rush and he did not reach for his guns, because reaching for guns is not the response of a man who knows what he is doing. He came around the counter and placed himself between Gertrude and Whitmore with a quiet and absolute finality, and he said, "Put it down, Whitmore." Whitmore looked at him, and the gun was shaking slightly in his hand, which is the most dangerous kind of gun. "You have nothing without those documents," Whitmore said. "I have Kane's full testimony before a federal agent," Cyrus said. "I have the documentation from the bank clerk. I have the statements of 4 citizens of this town regarding the things you have done. I have marks on a cliff face that a tracker will testify to in open court. You have a loaded gun in a room full of witnesses." He paused. "This is over, Harlan." Something happened in Whitmore's face. Not a collapse. He was not a man who collapsed, but a settling, like a building whose foundation has finally admitted it cannot bear the load. The gun lowered slowly, and then it was pointing at the floor, and then he put it on the counter, and Gertrude picked it up with the unhurried efficiency of someone completing a task they have been meaning to get to. Whitmore was arrested that afternoon by Sheriff Granger, who had apparently decided that participating in the arrest of the man he had previously served was a better foundation for his future than the alternatives. And Redemption Creek stood in the street, and watched with the collective expression of a community that has finally stopped pretending it did not know. Judge Harrington arrived in Redemption Creek 18 days later, accompanied by 2 federal marshals and the contained energy of a man who has been building a case for 2 years and is finally in a position to bring it. The proceedings lasted 4 days and were thorough and methodical and, in the end, conclusive. Harlan Whitmore was convicted of the murder of Edmund Dalton, conspiracy to commit the same, multiple counts of fraud and extortion, and the illegal seizure of property. Brock Kane received a lesser sentence in exchange for his testimony. Sheriff Granger was removed from office, and it was noted in the proceedings that his conduct, while reprehensible, had ultimately included at least one act of refusing to perpetuate a grave injustice, which the judge acknowledged in his ruling. Clara Purdy's 40 acres were returned to her. The Espinoza family received a formal apology from the federal court and were approved for the bank credit that had been illegally denied them. Percy Doyle was not charged with anything, because his role had been to witness rather than participate, and Judge Harrington said privately to Gertrude that whatever courage it took for a man to maintain records against his own employer in the hope that justice might eventually require them, it was a courage worth acknowledging rather than punishing. On the last evening of the proceedings, Gertrude stood outside the courthouse in the warm May evening and looked at the town that had been her adversary for 2 years, and she felt something complicated and important and not entirely resolved, because justice, she was discovering, does not undo what happened. It does not give you back the 2 years of isolation, or the grief that was never allowed to be simple grief, because it was always entangled with the anger and the practical emergency of keeping the store open. It does not give you back Edmund, but it does something. It settles a weight that has been pressing down, and in the absence of that weight, there is a space where something else might grow. Cyrus found her there, as she had somehow known he would, because in the 18 days since they had returned to Redemption Creek, he had developed an unerring instinct for finding her precisely when she needed someone to find her and was least willing to admit it. He stood beside her and looked at the courthouse, and then at the street, and then at her. "How are you?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I will need several days to determine that." "That seems reasonable," he said. She turned to look at him then directly, with nothing between them and no immediate crisis requiring the channeling of all her attention into something practical and survivable. Just the man, just herself. Just the May evening and the knowledge of what had been built between them in 18 days of working side by side in the particular intimacy of shared purpose and shared danger. "You are leaving," she said. Not a question, because she was not going to pretend she did not understand what kind of man he was and what kind of life he lived. "I was going to," he said. There was something careful in the past tense. "And now," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I told you on the road to San Marcos that I have been moving for a long time," he said. "That was true. I have been moving since I was 17 years old, and the war took everything that was in one place, and I found that moving was easier than staying anywhere long enough to have something to lose again." He paused. "I am 34 years old, and I am tired of moving." "That is not the same thing as wanting to stop," Gertrude said, because she was precise and she needed him to be precise. "No," he agreed, "but I also find that I am entirely unwilling to leave this town." He turned to look at her directly, and his gray eyes were so clear and serious that she felt the full force of them. "I find that there is something in this town that I am not able to ride away from, and I would like, with your permission, to stay and determine what to do about that." Gertrude Dalton, who had not cried in public in 2 years and had not said anything in public that was not entirely necessary, looked at this man who had come when she called and had stood beside her without condition, and had treated her exactly as she was, and she said, "I would like that very much." The summer was the most extraordinary season of her adult life. Cyrus rented a room at the boarding house that was now run by Clara Purdy, who had reclaimed her property and her dignity simultaneously. and he helped Gertrude rebuild the shed that Whitmore's men had burned, and he assisted the Espinosa brothers in the construction of the small commercial space they were opening with their newly available credit. And he became, in a very short time, one of those people who a town wonders how it ever managed without. He and Gertrude had dinner together 3 evenings a week at the store, which they cooked together in the back kitchen with an ease and a comfort that felt to Gertrude like the discovery of something she had not known she was missing. He was a good cook in the direct and unfussy way of someone who has always fed himself, and she was a good cook in the organized and thoughtful way of someone who treats every task as something to be done properly, and the combination worked better than either of them independently. They talked during those dinners with the kind of completeness that she had almost given up believing was possible, not just the practicalities of the store or the town, but the things underneath. His childhood in Tennessee before the war, which he described briefly, and with a great care not to sentimentalize it. The loss of his parents to a fever when he was in the army, which he had not been there for, and had never quite forgiven himself for. The years afterward of moving through the territory doing work that was necessary and often dark, and that he had done with integrity, but not with joy. She told him about growing up with Edmund, who had been 4 years younger and had always managed to be optimistic in a way that Gertrude found partly maddening and partly miraculous. She told him about their parents' early deaths and the years of managing on her own, and the way she had developed a shell of self-sufficiency that was real and necessary, but had become, over time, more hermetically sealed than she had intended. Edmund always said I was too careful with people, she said one evening in August, in the last of the summer light that came through the kitchen window. He said I kept everyone at exactly the distance where they couldn't hurt me, which was also the distance where they couldn't truly reach me. He was not wrong, Cyrus said, without cruelty but without softening it either. She looked at him. No, she said, he was not wrong. Are you keeping me at that distance? He asked, direct, the way he always was. She considered the question with the honesty it deserved. I am trying not to, she said. I am finding it harder than I expected to stop doing something I have been doing for 15 years. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, which was the first time he had touched her with anything other than the accidental contact of working in close proximity, and the warmth of his hand was so simple and so clear that her throat tightened unexpectedly. I'm not going anywhere, he said. I will be here when you're ready. I am mostly ready now, she said. I am just slightly terrified. That seems reasonable, he said, which was what he had said 3 months ago when she told him she would need several days to determine how she felt. And she laughed, which was a sound that surprised her every time it came out of her because she had not laughed freely in so long. He smiled then, fully. A smile that transformed his face in a way that she thought was probably one of the most important things she had ever seen. He kissed her for the first time in the kitchen of her store on a Wednesday evening in late August 1879, and it was deliberate and unhurried and entirely without the performance of romance. And it was therefore more romantic than anything she had imagined, because it was real in the way that only unperformed things are real. They were married in October, in Reverend Potts's church, which was full of people who had come because they genuinely wished them well and a few who came out of a complicated guilt that was making its slow transformation into something better. Vera Lund brought a cake of exceptional quality. The Espinosa family brought flowers from Alina's garden. Clara Purdy sat in the front row and cried with an openness that made several other people cry who had not expected to. Percy Doyle shook Cyrus's hand for a very long time. Gertrude wore a dress that she had made herself from the best blue wool in the store's inventory, and she stood up straight and looked at Cyrus Wells across the aisle of the church with the clear, steady gaze that she had always turned on the world, except that now the thing behind the gaze was not endurance but something entirely different. Cyrus stood very still and looked at her like she was the most important thing he had ever seen, which she was. Reverend Potts said the words and they said the words back, and the church was warm with autumn light, and the promise they were making was not a promise of ease or simplicity, but a promise of alignment, of facing the same direction, of building something together that neither could build alone. They kept the store. It grew. The rebuilt shed was larger than the original, and the inventory expanded as the town grew, as Redemption Creek began to attract new residents and new commerce in the absence of Harlan Whitmore's strangling influence. Cyrus applied the same methodical intelligence to the business that he applied to everything, and Gertrude's systems and his practical skills together produced something that was considerably more than the sum of its parts. He took formally to the retail trade with a directness that initially alarmed some customers and gradually won the deep appreciation of all of them, because he was the kind of man who would tell you honestly whether a product was worth its price and would remember exactly what you had ordered 6 months ago without writing it down. She applied Edmund's hidden language in a new way, creating a record-keeping system for the store that was so efficient it became something of a local marvel, and she taught it to the Espinosa brothers for their business, and eventually to Clara Purdy for the boarding house accounts, and the teaching of it gave her a satisfaction that was new and entirely welcome. The town changed around them, not perfectly human nature being what it is, and the legacy of 2 years of sanctioned injustice not disappearing on any timeline, but genuinely and substantially. There was a new sheriff, a practical woman named Helen Cross, who had moved to Redemption Creek from El Paso, and ran her office with a rigor that Granger had never possessed. The bank came under new management after Whitmore's conviction invalidated the previous arrangements, and the new manager operated with the unremarkable honesty of someone who simply wanted to run a functional institution. In the spring of 1880, Gertrude told Cyrus, on a Sunday morning over coffee in the kitchen that had become the place where everything important between them happened, that they were going to have a child. He went very still for a moment. She watched his face and saw the progression, something like shock, and then something much larger than shock that had no simple name, and then the full expression of a man whose life, after a very long time in the cold, has moved into warmth. He put his coffee cup down and reached across the table and held both her hands and said nothing, which was the most articulate thing she had ever known him to be. "I was very calm about this," she said, "for approximately 3 hours, and then I became completely unable to be calm, and I have been that way for 2 days. "That seems reasonable," he said. She laughed despite everything, and he came around the table and sat beside her and put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, which was something she still did with the conscious awareness of how extraordinary it was that she could do it, that there was a person against whom she could lean. The baby was born in October of 1880, a healthy and immediately opinionated boy whom they named Edmund Cyrus Wells. Edmund for the brother who had started something none of them could have finished alone, and Cyrus because it was a good name, and because Gertrude said with complete sincerity that she had no interest in being subtle about the important things. Edmund Cyrus Wells was, from his first moments, a person of considerable personality. He had his father's gray eyes and his mother's auburn hair, and the combined determination of both parents in a package that Clara Purdy declared was the most beautiful baby she had ever seen, while Vera Lund, who was less sentimental, declared was the most impressive set of lungs ever produced in Redemption Creek. Parenthood was what all things were for Gertrude and Cyrus, approached with honesty, handled with capability, and discovered to contain more feeling than any amount of advanced preparation could have accounted for. Cyrus, who had never anticipated this particular chapter of his life and had made a kind of internal peace with its absence, found that it undid him completely in the best possible way. The sight of his wife nursing their son by the window of the store on a winter morning became the image against which all other images of his life were calibrated. Gertrude, for her part, found that the wall she had spent so many years building around herself had not been demolished by any single event, but had been quietly dismantled piece by piece, since the morning a man in a black duster coat had walked through her door and told a room full of guilty people the truth. She did not miss the wall. She was somewhat astonished to discover that she did not miss it at all. 2 years after Edmund's birth, Gertrude was expecting again. This time she told Cyrus at dinner rather than at the coffee table, having apparently decided that important announcements were for meal times. He looked at her across the table with Edmund sitting between them determinedly eating bread, and he said, "How do you feel?" "Exactly as I felt last time," she said. "Calm for approximately 3 hours and then not calm at all." If you say that seems reasonable, I will put something in your coffee," she said. He smiled, and it was the full smile that she had first seen in the May evening outside the courthouse, the smile that was rare enough to be a gift every time it appeared. Their daughter was born in the autumn of 1882, and they named her Clara Ann Wells Clara for Clara Purdy, who had by this point become something in the nature of family, and Ann for Gertrude's horse, and through the horse for the aunt whose combination of reliability and temper she came to demonstrate at a very early age. Clara Ann Wells was a person of strong opinions and swift intelligence who could, from the age of approximately 3, reduce Percy Doyle to a state of cheerful incoherence with a single well-timed question, and who had her father's ability to go absolutely still and watch something until she understood it completely. The store expanded twice by 1883. The second expansion included a proper storeroom with a good roof and solid construction, and, at Cyrus's suggestion, fireproof walls on the exterior facing the alley, which was the kind of practical acknowledgement of history that both of them understood perfectly. Redemption Creek grew into a town that was genuinely different from what it had been. Not idealized injustice does not disappear from any community simply because its most powerful practitioner has been removed, but changed in ways that were real and lasting. The Espinosa business thrived. Clara Purdy added rooms to the boarding house and hired 2 women from town to help her run it. Vera Lund retired the saloon and opened a hotel, which was a change everyone agreed suited her considerably better. Gertrude eventually wrote down, in careful and specific detail, the full account of everything that had happened with Whitmore, beginning with Edmund's earliest letters and ending with the federal proceedings. She wrote it not for publication, but because she was a person who believed in the importance of accurate records, and because she thought that the story of what one determined man with a false sense of permanence could do to a community, and what a community could do in response when it found its collective conscience, was worth having written down. She showed it to Cyrus on a Sunday evening when both children were asleep, and the store was quiet, and the lamps were low. He read it carefully the way he read everything, and then he was still for a moment, and then he said, "You wrote about Edmund beautifully." She looked at the pages. "He deserved to be written about beautifully," she said. "He deserved more than that. He deserved to see this." Cyrus put his hand over hers on the table. "He did," he said simply. "I know." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat that way in the quiet store for a while, and outside Redemption Creek made its small evening sounds, and the children slept upstairs, and the ledger that had begun as Edmund's hidden record of injustice sat on its shelf bearing witness to the fact that truth, in the end, had proven stronger than power. In the spring of 1885, with Edmund nearly 5 years old and Clara Ann approaching 3, Gertrude stood on the front step of Dalton's general store on a Tuesday morning and looked at Main Street the way she had looked at it thousands of times, and the familiar shift in her chest that she always felt was not the tight, careful feeling of endurance but something open and settled, and entirely unlike anything she had felt in Redemption Creek in those first 2 years. Cyrus came through the door behind her with a cup of coffee and handed it to her without a word, which was a thing he had been doing for 5 years now, and stood beside her looking at the street. "It's going to be a busy day," she said. Supply delivery this morning, he confirmed. The Espinosa order is in. Clara Purdy needs more soap. There is a new family arrived yesterday from the east who will need outfitting. And Edmund has decided he wants to learn to track, Gertrude said, and has been asking Mrs. Figgins's cat to cooperate, which is not going well. Cyrus was quiet for a moment in the specific way of a man trying not to laugh. I'll take him out on Saturday, he said. I'll teach him properly. She looked at him. This man who had arrived at her door like an answer to a letter she had not quite believed would find its recipient. And she thought about who he had been, the solitary man in the black duster coat who had moved for 17 years through hard country, because standing still meant having something to lose, and who he was now. With laugh lines beginning to form at the corners of his eyes, and a son who wanted to learn everything he knew, and a daughter who already knew more than expected, and a store that bore his effort in every solid shelf, and a town that knew him as a man who could be trusted entirely. I love you, Cyrus Wells, she said simply, the way she said everything that was truly important. He turned to look at her, and his gray eyes were clear and direct, and full of everything he had been learning to keep in one place rather than distribute across the moving distance of a solitary life. I love you, Gertrude Dalton Wells, he said. I have loved you since you told me your reputation could not afford the distraction. I have loved you every day since. She raised an eyebrow. That is the least romantic beginning of a love story I have ever heard. It is absolutely the most accurate one, he said. She laughed, and he put his arm around her there on the front step of Dalton's General Store in the Tuesday morning light of Redemption Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1885, and the town moved past them in the way that towns do, and the store behind them held all the evidence of two people who had found each other in the middle of injustice and built something sturdy enough to last. Somewhere in her heart, in the place that had been locked and buried for so long, she thought of Edmund Dalton and his 4 words: stubborn, brilliant, brave, and entirely too alone. She was not alone anymore. She had not been alone for 5 years. And she intended, with every part of her considerable determination, never to be alone again. The coffee was warm in her hands. Her husband was solid and real beside her. Upstairs, 2 small and opinionated people were beginning to wake. The store was ready to open. The town was Redemption Creek, which had finally, slowly, after much urging, begun to deserve its name. The door opened on time, as it always did, because Gertrude Dalton Wells kept the door open on time and expected the world to meet her there. And more often than not, it did.